Welcome to the Foundations of Learning podcast. I hope to inspire you to actively participate in your child's learning journey, fostering a love for knowledge and nurturing the skills necessary for success in a rapidly changing world. Welcome back to the Foundations of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Shaylee Flint. Today, I'm going to be asking the question, is your child really behind in reading, or does it have something to do with brain development? Now, before I dive into this topic, I do want to say that I'm coming at this topic in the realm of being a homeschool parent. So I was a previous educator, but I am going to be homeschooling my own children. And so my take on this is kind of going to be in that realm, but I also think that no matter your child's path, this could be very beneficial information if your child is struggling to read. There are many, many factors that determine whether or not your child is really struggling. If it's the instruction, is it brain development? So many different things that are going to be a factor, but I am coming at this as more of a homeschool parent than I am if my child was going to public school, private school, because that is going to maybe change what it is that you are going to do. And I think it's important for us to note that the route that people take is, one, very personal and based on what you believe is best for your child, and two, the path that you're taking, whether your child's going to go into public, private, or even like a charter school, or whether or not you're going to homeschool. Because when we're looking at private, public, charter, it is actually very important that your child has some early literacy skills, which I will go into detail on. But it's important that they do have that stronger literacy foundation, because when you get into kindergarten, it's going to be like hit the ground running. And if they have some deficits in that early literacy portion of what they need, then it could make it so that maybe they fall behind. I'm not saying that's always the case. Some kids catch on very quickly, but you working one-on-one with a child is going to be very beneficial if they are going to be going into public, private, or charter schools. So I just want you to kind of understand where I'm coming from here. But like I said, as a parent, you should obviously make the choice that is best for your child. All you can do is take in some information and then analyze and make the best decision for you and your family. So an unpopular opinion that I may have on this topic is that I don't actually care if my daughter is going to be able to read by the time she's like 5 or 6 years old, or even 7 years old. And this is simply because I want to really flourish in her a love of reading by doing read alouds and working on things like oral language and social emotional skills, and really allowing her to play and be creative, and then working on motor skills and background knowledge and all of these things that are going to really be really important when she goes to actually learn how to read. And so those are some things that I want to focus on. And this is also not to say that you can't focus on those things and have, 5 minutes of academic time to teach your child the very early literacy skills that they need, which I'm going to go into in just a second. But I just really want to focus on those. And if she shows an interest earlier on that she wants to learn how to read, then I will begin those lessons because she is interested in it. There has to be a buy-in in learning. So whether that's talking about why we're learning something, or whether that's that they are just already bought in and they want to learn how to read, it's going to make it a lot easier to practice these skills and learn these skills for your child, because they want to do it. Now, this isn't to say that if they don't want to do it, you can't put your foot down and say, you know what, this is what we're doing and this is why, and we're going to do 5 minutes a day, and you incorporate things that they love into the lessons and incorporate play into those lessons. That's going to be super, super helpful. So the things that I'm going to focus on for early literacy skills for my child is oral language development. Oral language development is so, so important when we are going into comprehension and fluency, which is a big part of what we're going to talk about today. If we do not have that word in our language, we do not have an understanding of it, it's going to be really hard for us to, one, read it and decode it. And also it's going to be hard for us to understand what it is that we are reading, right? If I was to read a medical journal, I'm going to have a really hard time comprehending what that's saying just because I do not have the background knowledge or the oral vocabulary in that specialization. And so it would be really hard for me. I would have to learn the vocabulary first, and then I would be able to read and comprehend. So that is a big piece that I think is often overlooked, is that oral language piece. And I have seen a lot of kids in my classroom that have had oral language deficits. They don't have as much or as many words in their vocabulary. And this really makes reading fluency and reading comprehension very complicated. So background knowledge and oral language are going to be two really important pieces when we are talking about learning to read. And so that's why I want to make sure that my child we're just reading a lot of books together. That's going to foster a love for reading for her, as well as provide her with vocabulary that she may not hear in everyday language. Parents, have you ever wondered what your kids are really learning about important topics like taxes, freedom, and responsibility? As an educator, I once had to teach a social studies lesson that only focused on the positives of taxes, completely ignoring the downsides of over taxation or the importance of personal responsibility. It made me realize how limited the perspective is in many traditional curricula. That's why I'm so passionate about the Tuttle Twins books. These books teach kids both sides of important issues like economics, freedom, and entrepreneurship in a way that's fun, engaging, and easy to understand. They help children think critically and understand the world in a more balanced way. If you're ready to check it out, use my link down below to explore their incredible resources, give your kids the tools to think for themselves, and support my podcast. Another thing I'm going to be focusing on is fine and gross motor skills. This is so important for their ability to read and to write. There are studies that are done on the ability to even track words on a page and the correlation to the muscles in their eyes and how developed those are, as well as like the neck muscles and the shoulder muscles and the back muscles. There's so many pieces that actually play into whether or not we can track these things on or track words on a page. So that's an important piece, as well as their fine motor skills in their hand, which their fine motor skills in their hand for writing, we know that there is a bone in their hand that's not quite developed until they're around, I want to say it's like 4 or 5 years old that it's starting to develop, and then it's like fully developed by the time they're like 6 years old. And so it can be frustrating for them to hold a pencil correctly when they are younger because they just don't have that bone and muscle quite ready. And so I'm going to be doing things with her that really is working with her hands, working with Play-Doh, we're playing in dirt, allowing her to do things where she is working on her fine motor skills so that she will be able to hold a pencil correctly when the time comes. Something else that we're going to be working on during our read alouds is concepts of print. Concepts of print is going to be like, who is the author and what does an author do? Who's the illustrator? What does an illustrator do? This is the front of the book. This is the back of the book. We read from left to right. This is a word. There are spaces between our words. This is punctuation. Punctuation tells me how I'm going to read this, read this sentence, whether it's a period, an exclamation mark, a question mark, a comma, things like that you can just discuss with your child through read alouds. And that is going to be a super important piece when they go to actually read and write themselves. And then the last piece is phonological awareness. This is going to be an auditory skill that they need, and it's really just how can we manipulate sounds in our language. So we're not looking at letters, we're not looking at words, we're really just using the language that we are speaking and manipulating those sounds. So what I deem are the most important. We would talk about word awareness, syllable awareness. You can start doing like things like beginning sound. Rhyming awareness is super important. And then phonemic awareness, which is really a piece where we're looking at the individual sounds in a word. So we might have like the word cat. Can I segment those sounds? Can I blend those sounds? And then you could go into more advanced stuff like talking about, deleting this sound. If I delete the k in cat, what's left over? It's at, right? So there's certain things that you can do to make it more advanced. But all of these skills are going to build upon each other that will then lead into being able to learn to read and write. So there's a lot of things that you can do that's early literacy that has literally nothing to do with this is the letter and this is the sound, right? Now, if you wanted to go past that phonological awareness piece and you were like, I'm going to teach my child their letters and their sounds, that is totally fine, right? Like I said, if my child was going into public school, I would probably teach them their letters and sounds and start working on segmenting, two letter words and blending those together, because segmenting and blending of words can be something that a child is going to be working on for quite some time, because it's a skill that's actually usually harder for students to achieve. And so that would be something that maybe I would choose if I was going into public school or my child was going into public school. But because I would be homeschooling, like I said, we're kind of taking a interest-based approach, but I'm also going to be working on these early literacy skills that I just discussed to ensure that she is ready, so that as soon as we start learning to read and write in the more structured sense, she will be ready for that. One thing I want to preface before I also get into the research on brain development and learning to read, and looking at, is my child actually behind? Is it brain development or is it something else? As an educator, I was a first grade teacher. I saw a lot of students that were stuck in that decoding stage, like I had said, for a very long time. And I always wondered, like, even when I was using the very best, approaches with the science of reading and a structured literacy approach, I did find that they would be stuck in the decoding stage for a lot longer than I would have liked. And I want to also preface this by saying that sometimes I think as adults, we get a little bit impatient with kids, because we have to remember that learning to read is rewiring the brain. Our brains are not meant to learn to read. And so I would notice that my students were stuck in this decoding stage for quite some time, and that they were having a really hard time getting past that. And so therefore, their fluency and their comprehension was obviously struggling, because even if they had the background knowledge, even if they had the vocabulary, because it was taking them so long to sound out the word, blend it back together, and then keep doing that with each and every word that was in this passage, even though they were accurately reading these words, they couldn't comprehend it because their brain was still in that decoding process. And what I had noticed is that by the time they hit about that 7-year-old mark, and this isn't the case for every child, obviously, but for a lot of them, once they hit that 7-year-old mark, all of a sudden there was like this switch. They were starting to fluently read more often. So what I saw most often was that the older kids in my class were really getting past this decoding stage sooner than the younger kids in my class. And the reason I can say this is because in the middle of the year, we had to give a state test, which was really looking at how accurately they can read words, and how quickly they can read these words, and can they comprehend what it is that they were reading, right? So in that, I was noticing that a lot of my kids were in middle of year, were stuck on that decoding and blending. And this is something that they were working on in kindergarten. This is something they were working on with me in first grade. And then it was like this switch flipped. And after that test in the middle of the year, a lot of my students started to be able to accurately just read these words without having to decode as often. And so I wondered, is it something to do with their brain development? Now, before we get into fluency and comprehension, it is so important that you understand what fluency is, what comprehension is, and what children actually need to be able to do to be a fluent reader and to comprehend the text, which we kind of already talked about with comprehension. But let's talk about fluency. So there are actually 3 different parts with fluency. So fluency, we often say it's like you sound like you read like you talk, basically, is what fluent reading is, right? And so we have rate, we have accuracy, and we have expression. So with rate, this is how quickly can we read? Now, this isn't to say some kids like to think that reading is like this race that they have to win and they have to read super, super fast. If that is your child and they are not comprehending the text, I would tell them to slow down. Make sure that we're like, even if you're practicing it and you're reading it together so they can hear the speed that they need to read at, that's great if you're a fast reader. But if you're not comprehending what you're reading, that's a problem if it has to do with your speed. Could be background knowledge, could be vocabulary. But if they are a really fast reader and can't comprehend, try to get them to slow down and see if that makes their comprehension better. Usually speaking, if they're reading super fast and you get them to slow down, their comprehension increases. So that is something you want to talk about. We're not reading too fast and we're not reading too slow. It's basically like Goldilocks, right? It needs to be just right. Then we have accuracy, which is obviously how accurate are you at reading these words? And then we have expression. This is a part of like what I was talking about with concepts of print, right? That we understand that a period means that we speak in a certain way when we're reading, or an exclamation mark or a question mark, or even a comma, right? There are certain pieces in our text that's going to tell us how we're going to read it. And this is going to make our stories that we're reading more enjoyable. Really looking at those three things and that your child understands that when we read, this is how fast we should read. This is, we should be accurate when we're reading so that we know what we're reading, and we should have expression because that makes the reading more fun. When we're looking at comprehension, this is just the ability to understand what we have read. Now, like I said, this is going to require background knowledge of the topic and an understanding really of the words that we read. And a lot of the time it helps if we have those words in our oral vocabulary. And the way that we're teaching new words is actually super important. So when you're talking about teaching vocabulary, which I'm not going to get into today, it is really important for kids to understand like prefixes and suffixes and root words and base words when we're talking about vocabulary. Obviously for these littles, that's going to be like a very small piece of it. And it's going to be more about background knowledge than it is teaching vocabulary. That's usually down the line. However, that's super important in the comprehension piece. So even though we're going to go into this brain development, I do want you to think of your child and think, okay, are they still segmenting the sounds? Like they sound k, at, cat, s, at, sat, and, right? Like if that's what they're doing on every single word, then that's maybe a skill that we need to start working on, where I use like the slow-mo machine and they need to go from k, at, cat to going cat, sat, right? And really slowing those sounds down. And then eventually it will turn into cat, sat, and had a hat or whatever, right? So really turning that. So you have to think about the skills that they're going to need and where they're at before we even dive into brain development, right? So they're still in the decoding stage. We need to get them to the blending stage. Once we get to the blending stage, then we need to have the background knowledge. We need to have the oral vocabulary, and then we need to understand what it sounds like to be a good reader. And then they need to obviously understand what they read. Reading and writing are the cornerstones of your child's education. Without the right foundation, they can struggle, but with the right tools, they can soar. That's where the 5 Foundations of Reading e-course comes in. This course is designed to teach parents how to help their children master phonological awareness, which is the essential first step in literacy, phonics skills like decoding spelling patterns for fluent reading and writing, segmenting and blending, which are key strategies for becoming a confident reader, and orthographic mapping so that your child can learn spelling patterns and use them effectively. Last, you'll learn about high-frequency words, which are essential for fluency in everyday reading. You'll also learn the most effective ways to teach these skills, making learning time productive and enjoyable for both you and your child. Whether your child is ahead or catching up, this course equips you to support their journey to literacy success. Start today by visiting k3homeschoolfoundations.com or check out the link down below. So the first piece of research that we're going to look at, it's fairly new research, but it's called The Brain Basis of Fluency Development, Implications for Assessment and Instruction. This was a study done in 2020. Now, In this study, it examines the cognitive and neurological foundations of reading fluency to inform effective teaching strategies, and this is more particular for dyslexic students. A lot of the research that's coming out when you're looking at the science of reading and different things, we're really looking at dyslexic kids, but the thing about it is that when we're looking at the way that you should teach a dyslexic kid, it doesn't only benefit dyslexic kids, it benefits all kids. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. In this article, it suggests that the fluent reading and comprehension are more challenging for children under 10 because of the neural pathways required for automatic word recognition. So they're really looking at the ventral orthographic route. And they're saying it's still developing. So younger children primarily rely on the dorsal phonological route, which involves sounding out words by linking letters to sounds. This process is slower and requires more cognitive effort compared to fluent readers who quickly recognize words by sight. So when we're looking at a child and their reading, we are really looking at, so what happens is when we're segmenting our sounds and we're reading these sounds and spelling with them, both pieces are super important. You need to be spelling and you need to be reading these words. That is going to map that word into your child's brain, which goes into this word processing part of our brain and turns it into a sight word, right? So like they can look at the word cat and know that's the word cat. And they don't have to memorize it. They just have to map these sounds when they're reading and spelling, and it will turn it into a sight word. So that's kind of what they're talking about when they're saying that the words are turning into sight words. They go on to say that since the ventral route responsible for rapid automatic word recognition becomes more active around age 10, younger children typically focus on accuracy before speed. The authors argue that pushing speed too early before accuracy is established can be counterproductive, leading to poor comprehension. Like I talked about, accuracy and speed are two important pieces in being able to comprehend. So while young children can develop fluency, it requires time, practice, and a strong foundation in accurate word recognition before they can read effortlessly and with full comprehension. So again, this is kind of a nuanced thing that we're talking about here, because they're saying, well, their brain isn't developed enough to be able to do this because this part of their brain isn't developed. They can't comprehend text or read fluently. Now, one thing I do want to say is that all of these skills that we are teaching, our brain is so malleable. And if we're teaching specific skills and we're doing it in a sequential order and we're doing it explicitly, then your brain can adapt, your brain can start to develop. So not saying that, that kids can't fluently read before 10 or they can't comprehend text before 10. However, I do want to say that sometimes I think that it's important for us to at least acknowledge that that could be something that is the case for your child. Maybe, like I said, I've seen 6, 7, 8-year-olds that have fluent reading and comprehension of the text as long as they have the skills they needed before. But maybe it might take them a little bit longer to get there. And so that's something that I just want to, give you to think about as you're going on this journey. So the next one we're going to talk about is reading skill and structural brain development. So this study indicated that learning to read is a prolonged developmental process supported by the parallel development of multiple cognitive and linguistic skills, including fluency, accuracy, and phonological awareness. These skills begin to emerge prior to the onset of fluent reading and are refined as one continues to learn, suggesting that younger children may naturally experience challenges in achieving reading fluency due to the ongoing brain maturation. So again, it's kind of talking about here are the skills that we need. However, it could mean that it might take a little bit longer for your child to do these things just because they have ongoing brain maturation, right? Just as your child is going to take time to learn to walk, to crawl, to speak, and so on and so forth, right? They're building so many things in their brain, and their brain is constantly maturing and growing, that sometimes this can affect their ability in other areas. So the next one we're going to talk about is brain dynamics of a typical reading development, a review of longitudinal neuroimaging studies. This was actually done in 2020. And this was a review, or this review summarized findings from longitudinal neuroimaging studies on typical and atypical reading development, highlighting that the development of reading skills is closely linked to changes in brain structure and function over time. The findings suggest that younger children may face challenges in reading fluency due to the ongoing development of neural pathways associated with reading. So again, we can see that obviously when we're teaching someone a skill, we can see the parts of the brain that are lighting up, and we can see like, okay, that's why we know like, oh, this child's dyslexic. These parts of the brain are not lighting up, and these are the skills that we need to work on with them. But with dyslexic readers, it does take them a lot longer for them to accomplish these or master these skills than a normal developing child, because there are certain pathways that we have to work really, really hard to make concrete in their brain. And so this is kind of what they're saying as well for younger kids, is that, hey, it might take longer for them to get to this point, only because of the parts of their brains that are trying to develop to be able to do these skills. Now, there's also conflicting information regarding these findings, and I am not here to present only information that confirms any sort of bias. You deserve to have both sides. However, I do want to note that some of these are not studies. Some of these are just articles that people have written. Some of the articles they have provided with different research they pulled from to write these articles. But let's jump into it. So let's look at the other side of things. So the other studies were saying like, hey, you know what? Your child just may not be able to fluently read and comprehend because their brain's not ready for it. Maybe their brain is not able to get past that decoding stage in reading, and therefore they're going to have a hard time with fluency and then therefore comprehension. Okay. So this first one that is saying, no way, that's not true. Your child can learn before the age of 7, 8, 9, 10. Is the benefits of early reading mastery. This was written in 2024. This article discusses how early reading stimulates brain development, enhancing cognitive skills like critical thinking, problem solving, and memory. It suggests that with appropriate instruction and practice, children can develop reading fluency earlier than traditionally expected, challenging the notion that significant fluency is unattainable before the age of 10. Now, again, like I said, just because they're like, well, this part of the brain's not fully developed, does not mean that they can't do it if you are providing them with the correct instruction, and you're making sure that it is in a explicit manner and that you are structuring it in a way that is sequential to like building a house. So the next one is, what age should a child read fluently? This article indicates that children typically develop reading fluency around the ages 7 to 8. It emphasizes that with effective instruction and practice, children can achieve fluent reading earlier, suggesting that development of reading fluency is not strictly constrained by age-related brain development. Now, I also want to note that when we're like, well, typically children are going to attain, fluent reading by the time they're 7 or 8, a lot of it has to do with what the public schools are deeming when your child should learn something. So if it's that, your child should be able to read 47 words in 1 minute with 98% accuracy by the time they are done with first grade, then obviously we're going to be working on skills and we're going to try to get those kids there by the time they end first grade. I have had students where I am doing all of the things right, literally everything right. We're doing the structured literacy approach using the science of reading research, and we're doing all the things. Small group instruction is based on their skills. We're teaching skills. We're reviewing the skills. I might have an aide pull them and work one-on-one with them. Like, they are getting so much instruction on the skills that they actually need, and in a manner that is most effective based on our current research, and they still were struggling with fluent reading, and working on background knowledge and vocabulary and all of these other things, right? Like, I'm working on all of these things and they are still struggling to fluently read and comprehend. And then they get into second grade. I talked to the second grade teacher. They're like, yeah, they're still kind of struggling, and they keep working on it, keep doing it. And then all of a sudden, boom, it clicks for that child and they are fluently reading. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for every child. Some children may have something underlying that's going on, and that's why they're struggling. But I have seen that with kids where all of a sudden they hit second grade. We've been working on it in kindergarten. We've been working on it in first grade. Maybe I've brought them to an intervention and say, hey, like they're making a little bit of growth, but they're not where they should be. And we're kind of watching them closely, and then boom, second grade hits and they are just flying. So I have seen that. So a part of me, when I'm looking at this brain research, it kind of makes sense based on my own personal experience. And I don't know, you let me know, have you seen that with your child? Do you think it has something to do with their brain development? So the other one is reading and the brain. This is actually from the Harvard Medical School. And this publication emphasizes that while certain brain regions are involved in reading and comprehension, effective reading instruction can significantly influence the development of these areas, facilitating reading fluency and comprehension in children. Again, how often are you practicing the skill, right? Is your child going to build an oral language if you're not talking to them, if you're not reading to them, if you're simply putting them on an iPad? I know, but that doesn't help with their oral language as much as talking to them talking to peers, reading books, things like that. That is what's going to grow the oral vocabulary, or even listening to audiobooks. Those are super helpful in building oral language as well. So if you're doing those things, your child may talk earlier, right? Because you're talking to them and they're getting those interactions. If you weren't to talk to them, then yeah, they might have a gap in their oral language, right? So our brains are so malleable, and if we're working on the skills that we need, their brains are going to adapt, their brains are going to learn. So in summary, while the neurological development may play a crucial role in reading acquisition, effective early instruction and environmental factors can significantly influence a child's ability to achieve reading fluency and comprehension, sometimes mitigating challenges posed by brain maturation processes. So the big question, can your child actually become a fluent reader and comprehender of text before the age of 10? Yes. The answer is yes. Yes, they can. But it's not a one-size-fits-all answer either. Some children are going to excel at decoding but struggle with fluency and comprehension. Others may grasp the mechanics of reading but lack a deeper understanding. So there are so many factors that you have to think about when you're looking at that question. Can they achieve it? Is it brain development? Is it not? Really, the key takeaway is that you have to understand the role of the brain development, but you also need to understand the skills they need and making sure that you are building those skills and doing it in an effective manner. I want you to remember to always trust your instincts. You know your child best. Celebrate progress, no matter how small, and advocate for your child's needs, because if they are behind in reading, there are so many factors that could be at play. You want to be looking at the instruction they're receiving at school, or even the things that you're doing at home, whether or not you are building the house in that sequential order. Are you explicitly teaching these things? Do they have background knowledge? Do they have their vocabulary? There's so many pieces to this puzzle that's not strictly just about their brain development. So I hope that this podcast was helpful in understanding some of the components that are going to play a role in understanding whether your child's actually behind in reading. And like I said, the school system does put the children in a box, and they say by the time your child is this old, they have to know this. And I think it's important that we sometimes back up, look at brain development, and also look at each individual child and understand that every child is different and they're going to move at different paces. And some kids, it may take more time for them to learn a specific skill, and some kids, it might be super easy for them. That's going to be life in general. But I hope this was helpful, and with the right support and understanding, your child has the potential to be a good reader and a good writer. And we will see you next time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an update. Literacy is the foundation of learning, and every child deserves the tools to succeed. If you're ready to take the next step in your child's education, check out my website at k3homeschoolfoundations.com for resources, curriculum, and support to make literacy simple and effective.